And hey, really quick, by show of hands, who here is like a native New Yorker from like the New York City area? New Jersey doesn't count, but New York. Okay, keep them high. We're proud. We got to hold these things up high. Okay, good. All right, good group of people. And then I'm assuming the rest of you, show of hands, are like transplants. You're from outside of the New York City area. Okay, yep, fair enough, good, okay. So there's a lot of things that, like, this isn't to bash people from New York or outside of New York, maybe Jersey, but there, I need to stop. I haven't even gotten my second sentence yet, and I'm like, all right, hold on. Okay, here we go, reset. One of the things I love about New York City, and I think one of the things that regardless of whether you're from New York or outside of New York or have transplanted here or you're just here visiting, one of the things that I can appreciate, I think we all can appreciate about New York City is how many different things are happening all at the same time. And I think we appreciate that at a macro level, right? You can be uptown here on the east side doing something and not be aware of anything that's happening on the west side just across the park, let alone what's happening downtown or in a different borough. And there's an appreciation of that on a macro scale, but I'm talking about like an appreciation of all the things that are happening in a single moment, like on a micro scale. Like it's not just that there's a bunch of things happening across the city, but I'm talking about like a single interaction or a single engagement, and there can be a million different things happening in the background, in the foreground. You're like, what did I just step into? And there's so many of those moments, but I'll just give you a simple one that's not really anything wild or seemingly chaotic. It almost feels somewhat innocent, but as I speak it, you more than likely will have the ability to relate to this type of experience. Okay, you go into your local pizza shop, and you go to order your pizza. And there's a guy who's got the phone pressed like this, and he's asking you, hey, what do you want, buddy? And he's talking to someone on the phone. He's got his hand behind him, pulling someone else's pizza out of the oven, whips it around, and then he's ringing someone else up over here, and then he shouts at the end of it, next online? And it's like 7 people just got served in 4 seconds. He took an order. He pulled pizza out of the oven. He asked you what you wanted. He rang up another customer. Oh, and I forgot, he checked the Grubhub orders that are printing on the tickets. And you just like step into a moment like that and you're like, how in the world? Now, if you go somewhere else to a nearly identical pizza shop and that scenario is playing itself out, it's going to be 25 minutes before you order. He's on the phone. Hold on, sir. I'll take care of you in just a second. And then there's like 17 other things that he has to do. But here, in that singular moment, there are about 17 different things occurring in a single instance. And I have such appreciation, and I love that so much. But I also think it's one of the things why I find living in New York City so relatable to the lifestyle and the ministry of Jesus. And in fact, I find that life in New York City is probably, of all the places I've lived, most relatable to the way life was lived in Jesus' day. And I'll share what I mean, and I'll explain what I mean. And it's not to say that the gospel isn't relatable to other people or to other contexts. But I think sometimes it's easy, particularly in this city, where people value intellect, or they value degrees, or they value freedom of choice or freedom of beliefs or freedom of opinions, to kind of diminish or assume, or for people to just say, well, that was for them. That doesn't relate to how we live our lives here today. And yet I've lived in Florida and South Carolina and Washington State. I've traveled to other parts of the world. I've been to other cities. And again, it's not to say it doesn't relate there, but of all the places that I've lived, I find the life and ministry of Jesus most relatable to the way life is lived here in New York City. Think about it this way. Jesus lived in a day and age where people were housed very closely together. In fact, even to this day, if you go to Israel and visit some of the ancient biblical cities where there are remnants and remains of the structures, you'll find that literally this platform riser right here that I'm standing on might be the equivalent of a house or half of a house, and then adjacent to it would be someone else's house. And so they figuratively and sometimes literally lived right on top of each other, i.e. New York. Not only that, it was quite neighborly in that regard because you had proximity to the people you know. I've lived in suburbs where you live right next to your neighbors and you don't even know who they are. You pull into your garage, or they pull into their garage, they press the button so they don't have to talk to you, so they don't have to see you. And occasionally they might have like a neighborly wave like this, but that's the extent of the relationship. And yet here, you're bumping into people all of the time. It was quite a communal society. In fact, they lived in a bartering society, meaning they had to trade and negotiate and engage in conversation to connect with people, to experience things, to say, hey, I'll trade you this service for this experience, or I'll trade you this service for this good, or I'll trade you this for that, or I'll do this work for this. And so there was kind of like this exchange going place in these villages, in these towns where you saw the same people, you interacted with the same people, you bartered with the same people, just like we do when we go to the same pizza shop or to the same coffee shop or to that same restaurant or engage at the same place of business that we frequent to pick up our groceries or our personal items or whatever it might be. We go to these same businesses, these same places, and oftentimes interact with the same exact people. Not only that, they were limited by where they could go or how far they could go based off of how far they were willing to walk. I've lived in other places, and trust me when I tell you, they don't walk. They don't walk. Okay, how about this? You live in New York for a period of time, and you go somewhere else for like vacation or holiday, and then you pull up a map like, oh, like there's a restaurant. It only says a mile away. Like we could walk there. And then you find yourself walking on the side of a highway with this going like 55 miles an hour. Like ever happened to you? And you're like, what's wrong with these people? True story. We moved to South Carolina from New York City, and this is like 10 years ago, and we would walk because we missed walking. And on one occasion had someone like pull over, like, hey, is everything okay? Like they thought our car broke down and they thought we were stranded. Like, we just want to walk. We just want to use our legs. Like they don't walk when we're over here, we walk everywhere. Now, granted, we have a bus or a subway or whatever, but a lot of times when you think about like the whole of what you're doing, you're like, I'm not going to take a subway to go get a slice of pizza. I'm not going to take a bus to go like get downtown to go to this thing or whatever. Like it's like if it's here and local and I can walk to it, that's going to be my preference or my priority. And it was no difference in Jesus' day. They would walk. They were limited to by what they could get to or where they could get to on foot. And so in this regard, I feel like, this is really New York City in a nutshell. Sure, maybe not the density of people or the amount of people, but absolutely in terms of lifestyle and the way life is lived and the way we live our lives, the gospel and the way Jesus lived his life was actually quite similar. And there's a lot of nuances about this, but I think and beyond kind of the practicalities of where you walk or like what you eat or how you engage with your neighbors, I think actually when you read the gospel account of Jesus' life and you look at his life and you look at the stories that are taking place, oftentimes, just like at that pizza shop, there's a lot of things happening in a single moment. There's an interaction happening between Jesus and someone or a group of someone's, but at the same time, there are a million different things or seemingly a million different things all going on. Where there's this interaction, this is kind of the main plot, but then there's these subplots that are happening underneath. And you look at that and you're like, again, this is New York. And there's a great example of this in the Gospel of John. John chapter 4, and we'll get to a passage in just a second, but John chapter 4, let me kind of set up the context for you. If you are have been a Christian for a period of time or been a part of the faith or a part of a church community, it's possible that you're very familiar with the occurrences and the story found in John chapter 4. But if you're not, it doesn't matter because I'm going to refresh everyone's memory so that we're all on the same page. No one said thank you. Okay. I need some affirmation. Slightly insecure. You laugh, but it's kind of true. Okay, anyway, where am I at? Oh, yeah, here we go. All right. Jesus and his friends, they're traveling by foot from the southern region or his southern portion of Israel, a place called Judea, region called Judea, and they're making their way back to Galilee, which is where Jesus is from, which is where Jesus and his ministry kind of like took place, or they're like primarily took place. And so they're making their trek, or they're preparing to make their trek back up to the north. Now, in Jesus' day, this might be a journey that takes roughly 5 days, sometimes up to 6 days. Could be as quick as 4 days. If your friends and family come to visit you in New York and complain about how much you're walking, just let them know. At least you don't have Jesus as your guide. Because he's going to lead you for 4 or 5 days. And you're like, dude, like, surely you can teleport us. Like, surely you can just say the word and we'll be there. So they have to make their way north. But Jesus decides that he's going to do something maybe a little bit uncomfortable. And he's going to take his friends and his crew and his posse, and they're going to make their way back north, but they're going to go through a region called Samaria. And there's a lot to know about Samaria. There's just a lot that could be said about Samaria. But really what you need to know for the context of this message or this particular story is that Jews, like Jesus and his friends, did not go through Samaria. In fact, part of the reason why this journey would take 5 days is because they would intentionally and deliberately walk an additional day around Samaria so they can avoid Samaria altogether. They despised Samaria so much that they were unwilling to bypass or go through it quickly and would rather take a cumbersome journey and add to their trip an additional day so they could avoid it. But Jesus decides on this particular day, we're not going to avoid this. We're going to go right through this. And side note, I feel like that's a lot of faith. The things that we would want to avoid, Jesus is like, no, we're not going to ignore this any longer. No, we're not going to keep skipping out on this. We're not going to go around this. We're going to walk right through this. And we're going to dwell in this area until we dwell with it in its totality. And maybe I just feel like as I'm speaking this, that maybe this is what you need to take away from today's message, is that there's an area of your life, or as another pastor once said, some area of your life that Jesus is trying to take you and lead you through. And he's trying to get you there so that you can dwell there, so that you can deal with the issues of your heart. And you're unwilling, you're refusing, you've been hoping and trying and aiming to go through a different area. And Jesus is like, not today. Today we are going here. And if that's for you, then the best thing you can do is to say, okay, Lord, I'll follow. Okay, Lord, I'll go. And that's what his disciples did. Sure, it was wholly uncomfortable. I'm sure it's not what they wanted. I'm sure it's not what they envisioned for their lives. But they went through this area called Samaria, and they arrived to a place, and as you do when you're journeying and you're traveling, you need to stop off for a little bit of a break. Jesus was tired, and so we're told that he sends his friends off to go to the town or to the village to get some food, and he stops at a local watering hole, kind of like popping into like a Dwayne Reed or like a bar to just get a drink and do some, but this wasn't like an alcoholic watering hole, because if it was, it'd be packed, and so it was just a regular watering hole. It was just a well. Could you imagine? You can just go to this spot and like pull up buckets of alcohol. Like it would be like nonstop insane. Jesus knew better. He's like, no, this is just regular water. And he arrives at this watering hole, and there he has this kind of random or seemingly random encounter with a woman. Again, like New York City, all these interactions, all these moments, all these kind of stop-off points where you have random encounters with people that you wouldn't expect to meet, that you have no reason or no basis for knowing, and yet Jesus finds himself here at a well, having a conversation, engaging in a conversation with this woman. And it was so startling to her because she's like, hey, what, number one, are you doing here, Jew, in the Samaritan area? And then two, you're talking to me, you're a man, I'm a woman. This kind of interaction is not supposed to happen. But Jesus, being ever so persistent and willing to engage in things that we don't want to engage in, begins speaking with her and talking with her. And they begin talking about her story and her life and her failed relationships and the marriages that she's been a part of. And it goes from like her story, and they start having a theological conversation about God and about worship and some other things. And she comes to this realization that like, this is no ordinary man. And at first, she assumes that he must be a prophet of some sort. And over the course of this conversation, she comes to the realization he's not a prophet. He's actually the Christ. He's actually the Messiah, the one who's come to save and restore us to our true purpose and God's true vision for us. And she becomes ecstatic about this. And she runs back to her village. And she tells this village, like, man, come meet this person who's told me everything about my life. And they come out and they hear from Jesus, and he stays actually a few extra days. And it says that the whole village came to faith in Jesus Christ. Like a remarkable story. An incredible experience, and chances are that it's a story that, like I said, you might be familiar with or might be have a connection to in some way. But oftentimes, it's this story that I think what we tend to emphasize or focus on is this woman's response, or the fact that she was married 5 times, or the fact that the whole village came to faith. But there's a story within this story that's taking place that I want to speak of and I want to concentrate on as we jump into today's message. And it's actually just maybe a handful of verses that we're going to read and navigate navigate our way through. And it's this story that really, I think, today becomes the focal point of who we are, who we're trying to become, and what we're trying to do as followers of Jesus. And that set of verses is found in John chapter 4, starting in verse 19. And here's where we pick up in this story. Sir, the woman said, you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here at Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worshiped? And Jesus replied to her, believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when you will no longer, or when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes through the Jews. Verse 23 says, but the time is coming, indeed it is here now, when true worshipers will will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, and the Father is looking for those who will worship him in that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Now, several weeks back, if you're new or just kind of jumping into Met over the past couple of weeks, several weeks back, we started a preaching series that we called The Way of Jesus. And the whole focal point or the emphasis of this series is to help us learn the way of Jesus so that we can follow the way of Jesus and ultimately become like Jesus. And throughout the course of this series, over the past 5 or 6 weeks, we've been talking about practices and ways that you can become more like Christ. And the fact that there's actually a way to become like Jesus. And just as there is a way of becoming like Jesus, there's also a way of worship. And Jesus here in this passage explains it and speaks to it and makes the point and an emphasis that, listen, there is a way of worship. And to this woman in verse 19, it's interesting because right up to that point, they were talking about her relationships. And so she pivots the conversation and says, hey, are you a prophet? Like, isn't it funny when Jesus starts pressing into areas of our lives that we're a little bit uncomfortable with and we don't want to speak about? We try to change the subject. And we try to kind of, well, how about that? How about those giants? And Jesus, immediately sniffing out her tactics, says, okay, let me expose some greater truths here. Let me speak to a greater issue. Let me reveal something and show something. And effectively, he says to this woman, you have a way that you worship, but you do not know the way of worship. You see, there's a difference between the way you worship and the way of worship. Let me explain. The way you worship oftentimes has to do, and when I say you, let me be clear, I'm also including myself. But the way you worship oftentimes has to do with locations or preferences or music style or teaching style, or something that maybe is just kind of like, this is more personal in this way. That's all the way you worship, but the way of worship is actually so much bigger than that. The way of worship is so much more meaningful than that. The way of worship is actually far more transformative than that. It's not simply about the way, the hows and the who's and the locations and all of those things. It's so much more than that. And what Jesus was speaking here is like, hey, let me reveal something to you. Let me increase your understanding. Let me expand your perspective and your heart so that you can actually engage in worship in a way that is not just honoring to God, but in a way that makes you more like me. And what I want to do today is I want to kind of talk through the way of worship and kind of from this passage highlight some things that I think will help bring some clarifying vision and hopefully start shifting some things within us so that we can become more like Jesus and worship more wholeheartedly. And so I'll start with this first thing, maybe the first notion that she brought up, which is place. Place. Now, when the women first questioned Jesus about God and faith and theology, if you want to use that word, she made it about a place. In fact, check this out in John 4:20. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here at Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worship? Now, at that time, there was a bit of a disagreement about which was the true place of worship. As I mentioned already, there was a divide and certainly a bit of a tension between the Jews and the Samaritans. And if you're unwilling to go someplace just to travel through it, then you're not likely going to go to that place to worship. So there was this dissension and disagreement about what is the true place of worship. Maybe if you want to modernize this passage in some sense, she was saying, listen, you Jews say you got to go to a house of worship, you got to go to church to worship. We Samaritans are saying, hey, we worship in nature. You ever have that, right, where it's like, oh, man, I feel like close to God in nature, or I feel close to God in church. And it's like, I connect with God, and like I just worship when I'm out by the beach or up on a mountaintop. And she's effectively saying the same thing. Hey, we worship at this mountaintop or at this mountaintop where our ancestors have worshiped. You guys worship in a temple. And she was kind of assuming to a degree that worship occurred at a place, or that it was confined or limited to a place. And to be honest and to be fair, it's not all that different than what we might see or encounter today in Christianity. That there's an assumption or a belief that our worship is tied to or confined to a space, a church building, a church structure, or a location of sorts. And people are like, no, you can't worship over there. You got to worship over here. Or that worship has to happen in this type of building, and worship has to happen in this kind of format or in this kind of place. And we make it all about where you go to worship. No different than this woman. Some of us are like the Jews, and we say, well, no, worship has to happen in a church or a house of worship or a chapel or whatever it might be. Others will say, no, I worship out in nature. And then you always got that person or those people like, I worship privately to myself. I'm like, wait, what? I'll get to that. Don't worry. But Jesus replied, verse 21, believe me, dear woman, believe me, dear sir, believe me, dear man, believe me, dear person, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. In other words, the place doesn't matter. The place does not matter. Where you worship does not matter. Your worship is not limited to or confined to a mountainside or a chapel or a church building or a center like this or a building like this or a school or where there's all these people up on stage. Your worship should not be confined to that. According to Jesus, the way of worship is actually much bigger than that, and it can happen anywhere, not and everywhere, not just in one place. And let me tell you this, and let me speak this to you in a loving way. And hopefully in an exciting way. But if you limit your worship to a singular place or say that my worship can only happen in this way or at this place, then listen, not only are you doing it wrong, but you're missing out. You're missing out. Because you are getting a sliver and a portion and maybe a fraction of what God actually intends for you to experience and to have through your worship. So you say, well, Ricky, if it's not about the place, then what is it about? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that leads to the second thought. It's about a person. It's not about a place, but it is about a person. The way of worship is about a person. Despite our confusion about places and locations and mountainsides and churches, it is about a person. In the Old Testament, worship was about a person. In the New Testament, worship is about a person. In today's day and age, it is about a person, and that person is God. Worship has been, is today, and will continue to be about God and God alone. It's not about the building or the structure or the environment or the scenery. It is about a person. Jesus, again, speaking. I think he could have been a little bit kinder, but he says this, you Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him. I mean, in fairness, he's the one that is being worshiped, so he's kind of like, oh, you guys don't get it. But, he said, can I kindly explain something to you? Can I just let you know, hey, you know very little about the one you worship. We know all about him. So what he's saying to her is, you're kind of missing the mark here. You're making it about a place, but it's not about a place. It's about a person. And we know this person, and you can know him too. You can know who he is. You can understand what he wants. You can know why he's worthy of your worship. From the very beginning, God has made it abundantly clear through his word and to his people that only he is worthy of our worship. Not our bosses, not our careers, not our bank accounts, not our spouses, not our partners, not that objective, not that status, not that title, not the letters behind your name. Only he is worthy of our worship. And you know why that is? There's a lot of reasons why, but let me just share this just kind of very functionally and practically as a person. Anytime I've made my worship about something other than God, I have left and I have walked away feeling wholeheartedly disappointed. Because that thing or that person is unsuited and incapable to carry the worship that I put upon them. It's unfair to them. Only God is capable of holding that and carrying that at any time we make our worship about something other than God or someone other than God. We leave ourselves desiring more. We walk away feeling deflated and disappointed because only he is capable of carrying that and holding that weight. So we see the place of worship, we see the person of worship, and now let me share with this kind of final thought with you. While the way of worship may not be something that you're entirely familiar with, or it may not be something that's limited or confined to a space, one thing that's clear is there is a practice of worship. Practice is a custom or a habit. It's something that you do regularly and consistently in order to kind of maximize your understanding or your ability or your skill in a particular area. It's something that almost becomes kind of a part of your being, right? There's a reason that we say in medicine, the practice, right? The doctors are practicing medicine because they're learning and they're growing and they're getting better. Law, it's practicing law so that we can, as laws change, as new laws are implemented, we're practicing law and applying the law to the situation or the circumstance. Professional athletes practice so they can get better and maximize their performance and their output. So the practice is something that we're familiar with in many avenues or veins of life, but it's also something that exists within the way of worship. And Jesus said it this way, verses 23 through 24, he says, "But the time is coming, indeed it is here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." That's the practice. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way, for God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Now, much has been written and much has been said by this particular phrase. What did Jesus mean in spirit and in truth? But before I kind of share my 2 cents, let me just ask another question. Again, I'm asking you this because I care. Who here has gone to school beyond like a bachelor's degree of like college? So you've got like a graduate program. Raise your hand high. It's okay, you're not bragging. I asked you this. Okay, great. You guys are smarter than me. So I'm a simple person. I'm going to try to explain this in a simple manner. When Jesus spoke about worshiping in spirit and truth, what he meant is simply this. The spirit is about our heart and our emotion resulting in passion. And truth is about our knowledge and our understanding that leads to or provokes a response. If you want a deeper or more comprehensive understanding of spirit and truth, let me advise you, find somebody else. But the best that I can surmise and the best that I can understand and the best that I've experienced or understood, when it comes to worshiping in spirit, it's about our heart and our emotion that results in passion. And when it comes to worshiping in the spirit in truth, it's about our knowledge and our understanding that provokes or that leads to a response. Let me break this down maybe a touch further. You know when you know something, when you learn something, let's speak to this truth portion first. It would be, let's say you have a particular way of doing something, getting a job done. Think about something that you do frequently or often at home or in your place of work or in your school or in your studies. It's a process. You do something, you have a way of doing it. But then it comes to light that there is maybe a more effective or more efficient or more productive way to do that same thing. You are revealed or exposed to a new truth. So when you have the knowledge and the understanding of that new truth, your response should be, I should do this differently. I should do this and engage this in that better way, that more efficient way, that more effective way, because it leads to something better, because I have truth. Now, if you know there's a better way to do something, if you have knowledge and you have understanding and you know that it's the truth, but you don't act on it, don't we get frustrated by those people? Like, why are you doing this way? And so when it comes to our knowledge and our understanding of God, as we know about God, as we understand God, it should prompt and lead to a greater response about who God is. It shouldn't be that, oh, we know a lot about God, so we're distant and turned off by it. Or we know a lot about God, so I'm kind of stiff as a board and I act like, it doesn't pertain to me. But that's where the spirit portion comes in. Because you can worship in truth, or you can know the truth of God and not be engaged emotionally. It's not just the intellect, it's the emotion. And in spirit, our heart and our emotion results in passion. I'm emotionally connected to this. Any sports fans in the room today? Okay, several, right? You ever yell at your team? It's okay. Listen, no one's going to judge you. You ever cheer for your team? Because you're emotionally invested. Now let me ask you this. You ever played for that team? Me neither. But I'm emotionally connected. My heart is there. My emotions are there. And so like there's passion. I'm yelling all week at the flipping Yankees game. Like, what are you doing? What's going on? Home, oh yeah, I'm like going nuts. There's passion. And spiritually, it ought to be the same. That as we know about God, as we connect with God, as we engage with God, it incites and evokes this emotion in us. Our hearts become attached, and it results in passionate expression. Man, if you can cheer for a team, get excited about a team, yell for a team, bang on some wall because you're like, yeah, that's my guy. And you don't even know that guy. Like, surely we could do that for God. Surely we could do that for someone who's done everything for us. Surely we could step into something and engage in something intellectually and emotionally and have our bodies and our voices and our faces respond accordingly. And when Jesus was encountering this woman, or when he encountered this woman, and when he connected with her, what he was revealing to her is like, listen, there's more to the story here. You're limiting yourself. You're losing sight of the big picture by making it about a place. And he says, there's a time that is coming. Indeed, it is here now, where true worshipers, people who look like me, follow me, and are becoming like me, will worship in spirit and in truth. And so today, I want to give us the opportunity to do this. And in just a moment, we're going to sing a couple of songs, but I've got to let you know, we're going to give some instruction first. Don't worry, it's nothing crazy. You don't have to do anything wild or reckless. It's not going to be any whatever. Anyway, I just got to stop. It's been a long weekend. This is my fourth sermon in 3 days. So if it's good, praise God. If it's not good, come back next week. But here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask everyone to stand to your feet. And I'm going to invite our worship team up. But we're going to do a couple things to help connect to God in spirit and in truth. And so first, before we get started with anything physical or demonstrable, here's what everyone just close your eyes. And as we begin, I want you to think about God. I want you to think about the love of God. We're told specifically about Jesus that there is no greater love than a man who lays down his life for his friends. This was Jesus' words. And then he said, I call you my friends, and I lay down my life for you. Think about the way God has strengthened you in times of vulnerability or fear or weakness. Think about the ways that God has ministered to you in times of hurt and brokenness. Think about the truth of God's faithfulness, that he will never leave us. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. Think about who God has been to you. And as you think about these things, as you reflect on the knowledge and the understanding that you have, let it prompt or provoke a response intellectually that shifts and transfers over to our emotions. And when you think about God, and you think about those emotions of joy, of relief, of gratitude, of celebration, allow it to kind of stir within your heart, within your spirit. You know, when Jesus spoke these words, effectively what he was saying is, give him all you've got, all of your mind, all of your heart, all of your spirit. Don't hold anything back. Now, everyone, I want you to look up toward me. And here's what we're going to do. Your body does a lot of cool things. But here's what I want you to practice. Everyone smile. Be happy. Practice moving your mouth as if you were talking, but don't say words because people think we're talking in tongues. You could if you go for it. Just move your mouth up and down. Like you're talking, like you're singing, like you're in a conversation, right? Like our mouths move. You see people like sway their body. That's all those hands up. Yeah, you can put your hands up. Keep your hands up for a second. Let me explain this. 4 different words are used throughout the Old Testament of the Bible that reflect a posturing of putting our hands up in praise and worship of God. 4 different words. It was as if God wanted us to know when we come to him, man, we can praise. We can put our hands up. So we're going to sing a couple songs. You can put your hands down for just a second. We're going to sing a couple songs that speak to the truth of who God is. And I want you, as you reflect on these lyrics, as you sing these words, sing with your mouth. Smile with the feelings and the joy and the emotion that God has instilled within you. Express your worship. Make yourselves at home. Get comfortable raising hands and giving God praise. So let me speak to the guys for just a second. Because the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and he said, I want the men to praise and pray with hands lifted high. It's interesting that he called out the men. But then you see sometimes we're easy to kind of shrink back. But the Apostle Paul gave a bit of instruction, said, men, praise and pray with your hands held high. So men, let's lead the way. Amen. Let's worship. Let's sing these songs, and I'll come back and close this out.